It's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today, where we put a bit of spotlight on the UN General Assembly in 2020. So it is 75 years after the signing of the UN Charter and the creation of the UN, and we all recognize that the world today looks very different from what it used to look like back in the day. And many of the challenges we're facing today require global cooperation. And I think when we talk about global cooperation, there is no better place to take the pulse of the situation than by looking at the UN General Assembly, and in particular, the high-level segment of the UN General Assembly that takes place every year at the opening of the UNGA. And in order to get a sense of the situation, we have a whole team of researchers at Diplo from our data and AI labs that took a very close look at what has been discussed and how it has been discussed. It is my pleasure to introduce them. We have Natasha Perucic, Katarina Angelkovic, Andrijana Gavrilovic, and Jovan Negic. In addition, we are also joined by Stephanie Fillon, who is a reporter specializing in international affairs, based at the UN headquarters, and who is a regular contributor to Pass Blue. But before we get into the debate, I wanted to turn the floor to Dr. Johan Kubalia, the head of DiploFoundation, to kind of give us a zoomed out perspective on what we've been seeing here and on our research. Johan, over to you.
Thank you, Katarina. It's great to see you all after the very successful webinar on Tuesday. I will just make a very short point on the context for this exercise. It is a part of Diplo's approach to augmented intelligence, where we are basically comparing what is human intelligence done by our researchers, two Katarinas, Natasha and Andrijana in this case, and machine intelligence, which Jovan Negic has been coordinating. You probably had the chance to access the speech generator as a first tool, but what is our approach is to anchor the artificial intelligence in the context of human intelligence. And through this process, also to learn more about about us, because artificial intelligence is becoming a mirror through which we can see how we frame issues in this case of General Assembly or cybersecurity, human rights. Therefore, this is a broader context, and I invite you here at the meeting or people who are following on YouTube, on Facebook and other channels to join this process where we are trying to anchor artificial intelligence into our cognition, human cognition, and to see to what extent we can do things in more smarter way, with probably more wisdom, more information. Therefore, it is a broader exercise, but what we try to do is to make it always concrete, not just to have philosophical discussions, which are always exciting, but also to reflect on the issues like, let's say, UN General Assembly. That's the broader context. Over to you, Kat.
Thank you, Jovan, for this. And I think today we will get quite concrete, but we will also show in detail how we use various technological tools to actually arrive at our conclusions in connection with the human intelligence, as you put so nicely. But before we kind of take this deep dive into our findings, let me remind you, our audience, that we try to make this debate as interactive as possible. That means we're looking for your questions and your comments, which you can post either in the chat here or on Facebook and YouTube. Together with the help of my colleagues, and in particular together with Pavlina Ittelsen, we try to collect all these comments and questions and get them back to our speakers, back into the debate. Speaking of interactivity, I have a small poll for you just to take a bit of temperature of the room. And what we're asking here is obviously about this year's high-level segment. And what I would like you to vote on is the speeches at this year's high-level segment of the UN General Assembly were A, business as usual and revealed nothing new, or these speeches highlighted a fundamental shift in practice and or in focus. So I wait a couple more minutes to see how you will cast your vote before I turn to my colleagues for a discussion on what their impressions and what their findings were. And it's very interesting to see so far, most people think that we're seeing a fundamental shift in practice or focus. So let me just end the poll here and share the results with you. So on this question of, are we seeing business as usual, or are we seeing a fundamental shift in practice or focus? Most of you, namely 75%, think that we're seeing a fundamental shift. And it will be very interesting to pose this very question also to my colleagues, if they agree, if they've seen a fundamental shift, or if they've seen more business as usual. This brings me to my colleague Katarina Angelkovic, who I will give the hard task to kind of give us an overview, general impressions from your analysis. What did you find, Katarina?
Hi, Kat. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we dive into the content of this year's statements, let me briefly reflect on a few things that were a little different this year. The greatest impression is certainly the fact that the vast majority of speeches were...
Could you put the voice a bit higher?
Oh, can you hear me now? I'm sorry.
Now it's better, yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, as I said, the greatest impression is certainly the fact that the vast majority of statements were delivered as pre-recorded statements, and the speeches of a few countries such as Togo, Tanzania, and North Korea were delivered on site by national delegates. And what is surprising is that the number of governments did not seem to have taken this transition seriously, as on the day before the general debate was due to begin, only a half of all statements had actually been turned in. And most of the recorded statements had the following form. A head of state or government or one of the ministers delivered statements from their respective capitals. And some of the statements contained excerpts from videos or pictures showcasing the message that the speaker intended to send. And to this end, one of the most interesting statements was delivered by the president of the Philippines, Mr. Rodrigo Duterte, whose entire speech was supported by a series of pictures and videos. So he showed the pictures of frontline personnel that was supposed to amplify the country's commitment to countering the pandemic. And then you had you could see images of modern buildings or highways that are aimed to support his reference to the Philippine progress towards becoming an upper middle income country. And except in the title, there was no real debate. The statements were announced by representatives of permanent missions to the UN. And there were a handful of interventions, though. The right of reply was mainly exercised by national delegates of countries with strained relations, such as India, Pakistan, or Armenia, Azerbaijan. Lastly, the statement that left a very strong impression on us was the one delivered by the president of El Salvador, Mr. Nayib Bukele, who interestingly noted that the General Assembly has become irrelevant to many people, as most of them have never heard or seen those statements, and some of them, especially the younger generations, did not even know that the Assembly exists. And he also criticized the UN for lacking leadership and for being reactive in tackling the most pressing issues that have affected all of us. So that will be all from my end for now. Over to you, Kat.
Thank you for these first impressions. And when we look at this year's high-level segment, as you said, one of the biggest impressions is obviously that the speeches were delivered by pre-recorded video. And I think this is an interesting point that we can reflect on a little bit more. And this is where I would like to bring in Stephanie Fillon, who is a journalist specializing in international relations based at the UN headquarters in New York. And Stephanie, I think you looked in particular at kind of what's happening this year at the visual level. So from that perspective, I would be really interested in hearing your kind of overview reflections on the UN General Assembly high-level segment. Stephanie, what can you tell us?
Yes, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes.
So you know, I covered the General Assembly, and every year at PassBlue, we sort of try to find a story that stands out. But because the videos were pre-recorded and leaders sort of had to do these evergreen videos because they couldn't respond really to one another except through diplomats on the ground, we quickly found out that the most interesting aspect was probably going to be sort of the visual aspect of these videos. And so maybe before going into specific, I would say that in general, I thought that the countries that stood out in their video speeches were sort of maybe smaller countries who maybe had something to win from standing out. I would say that maybe the big countries were sort of more traditional in the way that they orchestrated their video visually. So if we talk about France, and if we talk about the US, for example, they were either like from an office standing in front of a flag. So that's something I wanted to point out. And also I published a story halfway through the UN General Assembly looking at the do's and don'ts of digital diplomacy. And I also wanted to mention that a lot of the countries that I thought had the most interesting backdrop visually were actually featured on Monday and Tuesday the following week. So the last ones that, you know, either feature a foreign minister or an ambassador. So I have some examples. So I'm going to share my screen if I'm able to. Right here. Okay, can you see?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. So these are a few examples of interesting backdrop from Monday and Tuesday that were not included in my story. So they're from, I think, Burma. We have Nicaragua here. I just thought the backdrop of world map was very interesting. And now coming back to this story, we have here the president of North Macedonia, who of course spoke in front of a very beautiful ceramic, a traditional ceramic from the presidential palace. So some details that I thought were interesting, and some of them are from the 75th anniversary, so they're not from the high level debate. So that is an example from the 75th anniversary. That's the King of the Netherlands, who used pre-recorded video speeches to invite a youth delegate in his own video. And that's something that for sure in person, he probably wouldn't have been able to do. And I thought it was definitely something original, and especially for the 75th anniversary, you know, these youth were kind of central to the anniversary. So here we have Costa Rica, who spoke with his mask on during the whole time. So it was an interesting message that he sent during the pandemic. And Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela also started his speech with a mask on, but he took it off instead of keeping it like Costa Rica. So here we have Duterte, but Katarina already mentioned it. So I thought this was very interesting too. And here, Vladimir Putin, so a kind of traditional video, but I thought the visual aspect of it is very interesting because one thing about Vladimir Putin's image that is important is the fact that it's very short. And I think it often is reflected in a way, you know, whenever he's around other states leader, he doesn't want to look short. And I think in this video, they did a very good job at making him look tall. So by having the podium and the microphones very low, I think his communications team actually did a good job at making Putin look sort of powerful and tall. And these small details I think are very important in recorded videos. Now, some countries that didn't do as well as others. So this is Paul Kagame of Rwanda. He had a teleprompter, and it was very obvious in his video because we could see from his eyes that he was reading, and it stems from the fact that the teleprompter was not placed well in the video. So that's a small mistake from the communication team, but that had the impact of making the video really look not natural at all. So if I were part of this communication team, that's a small thing I would have changed. Now we have South Sudan. That's something that a lot of people commented on. You know, of course, he always goes around with his cowboy hat, but I think the video made his watch look especially shiny here. And I think in general, you know, when you're a leader, you don't really want to show off, you know, your golden, probably Rolex watch. And I think this video made it very obvious that he had it. And we thought it was a mistake, especially in a country where the GDP per capita is around $1,200 a year. And now Afghanistan, and that's something that we've seen in the video from Kazakhstan as well, is the way his hands are on the desk. So I think, you know, he probably asked his communication team what to do with his hands, and they probably told him, you know, keep them on the desk, because both of the videos, when you watch them, it was sort of painful because they really looked uncomfortable. You know, the hands were there, they wouldn't move them. So, you know, if I had to give him an advice, it would just be, you know, be natural, just do whatever you need to do with your hands like you would do it naturally. And the final thing is, you know, when I talked to Mr. Corbaria here before the interview, I think we were all looking forward to Estonia because, you know, they're this digital hub and they're always fascinating when it comes to technology. And the president, she did a great job. The video looked great, but there was no special touch. So we just wanted to mention it, that maybe next time, you know, we would like to see something really special from Estonia.
Thank you so much for this overview. And I find it really interesting to see the interplay between what you said, Stephanie, and what my colleague Katerina said. On the one hand, there's this impression that some countries did not take it seriously by not having their videos ready well in advance. On the other hand, Stephanie, you remind us of all the little details that you can actually play with. And I think, as you said, that it was especially smaller countries who really took this opportunity. What I also noted is that with these recorded video statements, there seems to be a lot more challenges and a lot more things that, so to speak, can go wrong, or things that we need to keep in mind. And I think this is something that would be great to reflect on further. So if you have any questions or comments on these aspects, please submit them to us so we can kind of get into the details of this very, very interesting discussion. But from the general overview and from the kind of visual impressions we got at this year's high-level segment of the UN General Assembly, I want to start going a little bit into the details and the kind of the topics that were discussed. This brings me to my colleague, Natasha Perucic. And Natasha, for you, I would be really interested to kind of hear your reflections on the topics that were discussed. Obviously, COVID-19 was probably a very, very prominent topic, but perhaps on that, but also beyond that, you could share some impressions on the things that have been discussed.
Thank you, Kat. I would just like to wish a warm welcome to everyone watching us. So as you already mentioned, COVID-19 was indeed a very prominent topic. From a total of 194 statements that we analyzed from the high-level segment of the General Assembly debate, only 5 speeches didn't make a reference to the pandemic. The rest made some sort of mention. The term pandemic itself appeared over 930 times in the statements, and variations of COVID-19, coronavirus, and the like appeared more than 330 times, which emphasizes the importance that the heads of states and governments gave to the subject. In a number of cases, like for instance, China, the United Kingdom, but also the Czech Republic, entire speeches were actually built around coronavirus and the pandemic. And this should come as no surprise, given that the very theme of the debate was actually dedicated to COVID-19 and multilateralism, amongst other things. To be very frank, I would say that the health crisis was perhaps the only new topic that appeared on the agenda, in addition to multilateralism, reform of the UN, realization of SDGs and climate change that we have already seen on the agenda in the previous years. So while some countries made brief mentions of the pandemic as a topic of its own, we also saw that many others made a connection between COVID-19 and the issues that I just mentioned. So in the next couple of minutes, I will try to go over these different contexts of how COVID-19 was actually discussed. One of the directly related topics to the pandemic was that of vaccination, and the term itself also appeared at least 150 times in the statements that were delivered. So many countries here expressed concern about the so-called vaccine nationalism and argued that the COVID-19 vaccine should be a global public good available to all member states. In that context, countries expressed support for COVAX, which is basically a global initiative that aims to facilitate the development and production, but also access to COVID-19 vaccines. In the context of health, countries also spoke about the need to strengthen the global health system, including provisions of equipment to the World Health Organization that has played a rather significant role in the pandemic, but also the recovery of national health systems that have been pushed to the limit by the crisis itself. When it comes to economic recovery, countries touched upon the and other economic issues, countries touched upon the GDP. They spoke about the rising levels of unemployment, disruptions of supply chains due to lockdowns and global shutdowns. They also spoke about the shutdowns of certain industries like tourism that for certain states, in particular small island states like the Bahamas, Grenada, and Maldives, is particularly important. They also spoke about the obstacles to free movement of migrant workers that the travel restrictions brought about. So along these lines, we saw that many argued that we are behind on the realization of sustainable development goals and that their achievement will be rather difficult in the decade of action. However, they mentioned that in order to reduce the detrimental effects of the pandemic, it is countries asked for, in particular developing countries, asked for debt relief and called on the international partners to assist them in this. They have also praised the assistance that they have received so far from the World Bank, the IMF, and the OECD, but also from the Global Humanitarian Response Plan that was launched by the UN Secretary General in order to help the poorest countries in their combat against COVID-19. When it comes to the traditional theme of conflict, countries spoke about the protracted violence in Mali, in Sudan, but also the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, the violations of ceasefire in Nagorno-Karabakh. Countries applauded the UN Secretary General call for ceasefire in all conflict areas. However, others spoke about the vulnerability of certain groups, namely women and girls in conflict-affected areas where they faced even greater difficulty in accessing fundamental and essential health services. Last but not least, certainly countries spoke about multilateralism and interconnectedness. And this was actually something that brought the subject of COVID-19 into focus for many. They said that the crisis itself has illustrated how interdependent and interconnected our world is, and that international cooperation is needed more than ever. And this is something that they advocated in favor of multilateralism and international cooperation in order to build back better. This would be basically an overview of what was discussed in the majority of statements. Over to you.
Thank you. For me personally, some surprises there, but also some things that were perhaps not so surprising. Also, especially the slogan to build back better, but also this question of where are we in the timeline to the SDGs and what can we do at the moment because we are behind on the SDGs. On this issue of what kind of topics were discussed, there is, in my opinion, one elephant in the room that we haven't addressed yet, and that's digital topics. Digital policy. And at DiploFoundation and the Geneva Internet Platform, it's obviously one of our focus areas and where we always listen very keenly on what's being discussed. So I would like to turn to my colleague, Andriana Gavrilovic, to kind of, tell us, what about digital topics? From what Natasha said, we almost get the impression that digital topics were completely absent from the debate in these times of crisis of COVID-related and health-related issues. Is that right? Or what did you find?
Well, the short answer is no, that is not right, but I'll elaborate. Stephanie mentioned that you could see one of the leaders read. You will see me read now. I have two good excuses. Number one, there is some UN lingo that I will have to read because no one can remember that. And, written and spoken language are very different. And the second is I actually plan to repurpose this text. So please do bear with me. As far as digital policy goes, we have been following digital policy issues on the agenda of the United Nations General Assembly since 2017. So that's 4 years now. And digital has never failed to make the cut, and it didn't fail so now. Delegations pledged to improve digital cooperation in the declaration on the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And the declaration puts as priorities shaping a shared vision on digital cooperation and addressing digital trust and security. Why? Because now we are relying more than ever on digital technologies, as per the declaration. And this is why there was a series of events on digital cooperation organized by the international community from mid-September until the 5th of October. And here we saw UNDP, UNICEF, ITU, UNODA, Cybersecurity Tech Accord, which all organized events. So while this research team was reading the statements and following the videos, there was also another team of Geneva Internet Platform rapporteurs that followed these events and wrote reports on them. And they addressed harnessing the power of data and digital technology for health transformation, protecting human rights during the crisis, and in general, leveraging digital technologies for sustainable development. And I see that Pavlina, my colleague, just dropped that link in the chat. This year was a bit different to others that we had followed, because this year we had the commemoration of 75 years segment, and 113 countries sent pre-recorded statements. Out of those 17 mentioned digital technologies, mostly in the development context. That is understandable, because countries only had 3 minutes to address all the pressing issues that they have. And it's a bit like Eurovision. There is just no time for that last chorus. And then, considering the general debate, when we look at the numbers, out of 176 statements developed, 76 mentioned digital policy issues in 2020. Now, that's not a tiny number. And since we have been following digital policy issues since 2017, let me give you some other numbers just to put things into perspective. So according to our previous research, in 2017, 47 statements tackled digital issues. In 2018, it was 63. In 2019, it was 84. And this year, it was, as I said, 76. Now, it's interesting to know that 2018 was actually the year in which the Secretary General included digital issues as top priority issues. Yet this year, we have observed 13 statements more that tackle digital issues. However, this is also the first year in which we have actually seen a decrease of the number of statements mentioning digital issues compared to the previous year. This year, we have 8 statements less than we had in the previous year. And this is also despite the pledge to improve digital cooperation. All in all, it might be contrary to our expectations that more countries would be concerned with digital policy issues, as we have shifted most of our lives online. But it's far from saying that digital policy issues were not represented at all. Back to you, Kat.
Thank you so much. Again, some surprising findings, some not so surprising findings. So for example, when we talk about digital trust and digital security in a time where more and more diplomats, but also every one of us relies on digital means, that's something we would expect. And I also found it quite interesting to kind of see this reflection on numbers, that we kind of have a growing trend for the last 4 years, but this year, not quite so much, which, as you said, might be due to heads of states and government and other officials only having 3 minutes and having to perhaps cut down on this. But it's great to see that digital issues were being discussed, and as you said, especially in a development context. So that was something I noted and I found very, very interesting. On this question of how digital is discussed, I actually would like to dig a little bit deeper. And if you remember at the beginning of our webinar, I mentioned that we're also going into data analysis that is supported by big data and AI. So I would like to hear a little bit more on our findings there to kind of give a fuller picture. And here again, I would like to turn to my colleague, Katarina. What can you tell us to go a little bit deeper on those digital issues?
Yeah, indeed, as you mentioned, we have conducted data analysis of all statements in order to identify the most frequently mentioned digital policy issues that are based on the taxonomy used by our Digital Watch Observatory. And to this end, the most mentions of digital were made by European states, as expected, 51, which were followed by South America with 25 statements and Asia with 22 statements in total. I'm not sure if you can see a chart. You can see a chart on your screen. It actually gives you an overview of representation of the digital topics by regions according to our taxonomy. And as you can see on your screens, issues belonging to the development basket, such as digital divide, access to ICT, capacity development, they were the most prominent issues. They were mentioned by close to 1/5 of all countries coming from, well, most of the regions. These issues were mainly brought into the discussion by national representatives of developing countries who called for urgent measures to bridge the digital gap. The second most prominent issue was cybersecurity. A total of 25 states addressed these issues. These are cybercrime, cyber warfare, child safety online, and several other countries, including Singapore and Slovenia, they talked about the cyberspace, and they stressed the importance of a trusted cyberspace that is underpinned by international law and norms of responsible state behavior. A third basket was the infrastructure basket with a total of 21 appearances, and it was mostly referred to by European delegations, and they mostly centered around AI and other advanced technologies such as 5G and nanotechnology. For example, Spain and Czech Republic, they refer to applications of AI in many sectors in their respective countries, such as healthcare, agriculture, environment, transportation, to name a few. On the other hand, Romania, Slovenia, or the Holy See, they pointed to an urgent need to address the challenges posed by artificial intelligence with the aim of developing technology that is centered, that is human-centered, and that is based on ethical principles. And lastly, which was a very surprising finding, is that the human rights basket was the least popular, with a total of 7 mentions, despite the fact that privacy concerns and freedom of expression were often addressed in the context of COVID-19 crisis. So that will be all from my end with regard to our findings. Over to you again.
Thank you so much. What I really like about this is that in this research, we're kind of juxtaposing quantitative and qualitative analysis. So kind of looking at the big data analysis, but also really going through the statements and kind of getting an impression on what has been said through that. But on this question of how this analysis was done, because it's very interesting to see, and I think it's really valuable to just have the numbers and be able to see what regions or what countries were particularly prominent on certain issues, in this case on digital issues. I would like to actually know a bit more on how this analysis was conducted. And this makes me turn to my colleague Jovan Negic, who can tell us a bit more about, so to speak, the technical details behind this. So can you tell us a little bit more about how this analysis was conducted, and then also perhaps about the potential of AI for text analysis, because that's one of our research areas. So it would be really interesting to hear a little bit more about how that worked and how this could work in the future. Over to you, Jovan.
Thank you. Well, when we discuss AI implementation in text analysis, there are a lot of things yet to be discovered and explored. It is still a greatly uncharted area with a lot of space for progress and for innovation and advancements. Nowadays, main attention is towards text generation, which is the field in natural language processing and understanding, and it is focused on imitating humanly written texts. This area experienced some big advancements recently, especially with the occurrence of some big and advanced, huge and advanced algorithms such as GPT-3. But we have to say that there is also a lot of hype in that field. It is definitely very interesting research. It had really interesting results. First, it's the first time that we had in natural language processing algorithm which is able to transfer knowledge across a couple of different tasks. But on the short side, it is still very hard to explain the answers it gave us. So we have to keep in mind that it is just one of many fields in natural language processing and understanding, and there are a lot of other equally important researchers and in the text analysis, and a lot of progress and in those fields as well. So when we as humans communicate with each other, we are not using just the center for speech or text generation in our brain. We are using a lot of different centers in order to understand the other person, to analyze its arguments, to retrieve some information back from our memory, or to form counter argument, and so on. So the whole system is evolved. So this is very important to keep in mind if we want to implement AI technology in the field of natural language, because we have to be able to deal with the biases and to explain the answers AI generated. When we ask AI to generate answers to some questions, we don't want just the answer. We want to provide us the answer and the explanation how it generated that answer, why it gave us such an answer. So the main focus on research in Diplo is in that field, and hopefully I will come back to that topic later in more detail.
Yeah, thank you so much, because you started talking about the actual creation of speech with the help of artificial intelligence. So that's really interesting in terms of speech writing, and a very kind of future-focused question. Are we going to see UN General Assembly speeches being written by artificial intelligence? There was a lot here so far. So again, I'm looking forward to your comments and questions in the chat. But for now, I would like to turn to you, Jovan Kubalia in this case, to kind of provide some reflections on what we just heard. Are you particularly surprised? Is there anything new to you? Or would you still say we're seeing more business as usual than a fundamental shift in the high-level segment of the UN General Assembly?
Well, the diplomacy is a profession of continuity and changes. It is typically a conservative profession, and these changes are not happening very fast. The statements are repeated as at least for the last 4 years, and that's how it is going. I have to admit that this change this year is remarkable in the sense of both modality, and I'm highlighting change. I'm not adding if it is positive or negative, and the framing of discussion. Now, what is interesting, what another Jovan mentioned in this discussion, is that you can find the patterns in these speeches, which are very, very clear, and we can move, I would say, over the next few years in really cognitive analysis of the way how the arguments are framed, including ambiguities, including double meaning, including these elements. And in that field, there will be some breakthroughs. Therefore, what we can in this continuity and change dynamics expect is that there will be stronger push and shift towards automation in the tasks like speech writing, but probably saving more time for diplomats, hopefully in direct contacts, in negotiating and dealing with open issues. That would be an interesting development. For us as researchers, it's interesting to see in a way, like through X-ray, what is the typical way of framing the arguments in diplomatic speeches, avoiding conflicts, signaling the position, testing the ground, how far you can go on a specific issue. And this is amazing. That's why this X-ray notion is extremely interesting from the researcher's point of view. Therefore, in brief, continuity and change, probably acceleration on the change side, and getting deeper into understanding the framing of the arguments in diplomacy. Over.
Thank you, Yuval. And also thank you for this reminder of this kind of X-ray of the UN General Assembly that we took with our analysis. And this reminds me of Stephanie's contribution on this kind of visual aspects. Stephanie, perhaps back to you. From all the things you've heard so far present in this fuller picture of the UN General Assembly, and from your experience as a journalist following these developments, was there anything in particular that surprised you? Or again, would you say we see more business as usual in the kind of topics and in the way the debate unfolded?
So I would say in general that we saw, the tendencies, and I think we see the dynamics that take place in person kind of just transfer online. I wouldn't say that I saw anything that was different in terms of themes, in terms of topic and everything other than the pandemic. I would just say that, the tensions and everything, leaders just sort of found ways to take them from in person to online. I didn't think that this General Assembly really stood out in general. And I think it was the opposite. I think there was a little less interest in general towards this General Assembly, but at the same time, observing the way, having a virtual General Assembly changes politics is definitely interesting.
Thank you. True. We have around 15 to 20 minutes left, and what I would like to do in this remaining time is basically take a look into the future, so to speak, and into the kind of future-looking issues that have been raised in this case. And as we already mentioned, one of the prominent topics that were raised were, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. And as we said, there was this concern about falling behind on the SDGs. And we also heard the phrase "building back better." Perhaps a question for you, Adriana. What did we observe in this regard? What is the concern for the future in this sense, and what perhaps is the suggested solution in this concern in terms of looking at 2030 and the SDGs?
Well, I'll go back to reading because first I'd like to point out what even is building back better in UN terms. The definition hails from 2016, so this is definitely not the first time it has been used. And this is how they define it: the use of recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction phases after a disaster to increase the resilience of nations and communities through integrating disaster risk reduction measures into the restoration of physical infrastructure and societal systems, and into the revitalization of livelihoods, economies, and the environment. Now, I assume that we all forgot the beginning, so I'll read that again. The use of the recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction phases after a disaster to increase the resilience of nations and communities. And now the declaration that I mentioned in my first intervention points out that we have this historic opportunity to build back better and greener. It also notes that this role that we will be building back better or rebuilding, because we've heard both terms, will be a more equal, more resilient, and more sustainable world. Now, on equality, one of the pledges is to leave no one behind. On resiliency, it was noted that the pandemic caught us unaware, and that to make our systems more resilient, we should learn and share experiences and information to reduce risks, which is not such a concrete proposal, if we may say. On sustainability, countries have pointed out that 2030 is 10 years from now. And at the rate we are going, we are not going to be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. COVID-19 poses serious challenges that undermine the progress that was already achieved. And some of the concerns raised were around climate change and the fulfillment of obligations under the Paris Agreement, then food security, quality of education, poverty, unemployment, and economic recovery in general. And this is where the debt restructuring and debt forgiveness topics come in. The logic is as follows. countries with large international debts are supposed to pay them off as scheduled, timely. But that means that they will really not manage to fight the economic impact of COVID-19. Much less will they be able to find the finances which are necessary to achieve the SDGs. And this is why we've heard quite a few times a very strong call to the Bretton Woods institutions and other international donors to assist in restructuring the repayment of debts for the countries that are the most affected, most of them African countries. We also saw a few calls for debt forgiveness and relief, for example, from the Ivory Coast and Vanuatu. But this is nothing new. African calls for debt restructuring and debt relief are nothing new on the agenda of the United Nations General Assembly. So it remains to be seen what exactly the response of the international donor community will be.
Thank you, but certainly an issue we need to keep an eye on. And as I said, it's not exactly a new issue, this question of debt relief, but perhaps a lot more pressing now because, as you said, there's perhaps a greater need to focus on economic recovery rather than paying back debts. And that's certainly an issue we will be keeping an eye on. I would actually like to also get back on this question of digital issues, because we kind of got a good sense of what kind of digital issues have been discussed at this year's UNGA, and also which countries were more prominent in raising digital issues. But kind of future looking, what challenges were mentioned, and perhaps how can these challenges be addressed? And I'm thinking in particular here of this question of the digital divide. And perhaps my colleague Natasha can give us a little bit more details here.
I will try to be very brief since we have some 10 minutes left to go, and it's already something that my colleagues have already spoken about. So a digital divide has been brought into focus by the transition to online education and teleworking. And we saw representatives from developing and least developing countries speak about the alternative practices that they employed, including, for instance, homeschooling through television in order to kind of manage the digital divide on the spot. But speaking long term, in order to address the digital gap, we saw that developing countries spoke about the need to improve access to ICT, something that was already mentioned by Katarina earlier on. They also spoke about the broadband coverage, which was very important for small island states, and capacity development, namely development of digital skills, which will be particularly necessary for the future of work. Some delegations like Estonia, for instance, they highlighted why digitalization is important and what role it has played during the pandemic. They spoke about the provision of digital services and payments that were facilitated through the digital platforms. They also spoke about the specific use of digital platforms for conducting business activities, and they spoke about the value that it has in particular for the younger generations. That said, the UN Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation, but basically addresses the notion of the digital divide in several instances through digital inclusion and digital connectivity, and that sets out the course of action for future digital cooperation was only referred to by the countries, by 5 countries. And the Secretary General himself did not make a reference to this document that is very important when discussing digital cooperation.
Thank you. Very interesting. Again, not so much new topics, but perhaps a greater urgency related to some of these topics. As you said, Natasha, we only have a few minutes left. And there's actually a topic I would like to get back on that I'm personally quite excited about. And we already kind of alluded to it. It's basically the question of, we've seen these speeches before the General Assembly on video this year. Will there be in the future a time where these speeches before the UN General Assembly will be drafted by artificial intelligence, by natural language processing AIs? And here I turn back to my colleague, Jovan Njegic, who kind of alluded to this possibility already. And Jovan, I know you've done some research into this question of, is it actually possible to use AI to draft those speeches, to create speeches from scratch. And you created a tool that we developed at Diplo called the speech generator. So basically 2 questions for you. Can you tell us a little bit more about how this works? For example, the speech generator, but also about the kind of the possibility of AI to help us draft these speeches. Jovan, over to you.
Thank you. So here in Diplo, we are also exploring possibilities in text generation field. But instead of trying to recreate and imitate humanly written texts, we are exploring the possibilities of imitating the human process of thinking while writing the text or speech. So we try to do so by selecting various state-of-the-art algorithms for different tasks, then connecting them with each other in a way that these connections imitate the human process of thinking, and then combining them with the human expertise. Currently, we are working on the speech generator application. You can see that on the screen probably now. It is an application which should help diplomats generate written diplomatic speech, and at this point, it works in the field of cybersecurity. So users can select issues from the sidebar menu. They want they can include those issues that they want to address in the speech. Then they can select the level of their agreement with a certain attitude, and the application will generate text accordingly. Then the user can review the generated speech. They can compare it to the positions of other countries, or just for fun, at this point, they can compare it to the position artificial intelligence would take on the subject. They can use the app to rephrase some text, to change some text, to get some tips from the artificial intelligence, or to manually edit it and to download the speech to themselves. If we look under the hood of the application, we talked to human experts and asked them to describe their process of thinking while writing the speech. And according to the process they described, we choose some algorithms and implemented some algorithms mainly for text generation, text classification, document retrieval, paraphrasing, summarization, and so on. We tried to reconstruct that process of human thinking by connecting those algorithms in some logical way. And finally, which is very important, all these tasks are done by combination of these algorithms and human expertise. We strongly believe that our main goal should not be to create artificial intelligence which is able to compete with human intelligence. We should open the road to cooperation between artificial and human intelligence in order to achieve something greater, which is called augmented intelligence. So that's mainly the sum up of this application and our approach to the research.
Thank you so much. Still in my mind, there is this question of how likely are we to see speeches, diplomatic speeches, for example, before the UN General Assembly that are not drafted by humans, but by artificial intelligence. Jovan Kubalia, what do you think? Are we there anytime soon? What's your assessment of this situation?
Well, the nature of speech is based on our analysis is something that can be replicated because they are quite formatic in the sense that they repeat the statements, they repeat the sentences. That's not necessarily the challenge. There are other challenges, poetry, literature, which are probably arts, which are more demanding. But the key is not necessarily in having the final product. We have this speech generator, and it's useful. Then the diplomats started using it, but it is exactly in what the other Johans mentioned in this research on interplay between human and artificial intelligence, in understanding what are the borders, in understanding how far we can go, in understanding artificial intelligence in order not to be artificially afraid of it. If we are strong, if we understand what is our intelligence and what artificial intelligence can do, will be more self-confident as humanity, and we will use it as an effective tool. This is our key point, because the current coverage of, including GPT-3, which is all over the place with Guardian and New York Times, is basically a bit sensational. By who we have this. The key is to dig deeper into the logic of the system of neural networks and say, hey, yes, we understand it, and here are the limits. Here are limits of machine, and we can use machine to help us to do it better. Therefore, I would say probably it won't be that difficult to generate GA speeches because they have typical format. But it is not the main question. The main question is that we understand how far a machine can go and how we can remain in charge. And that's the ultimate point of our research. Because unfortunately, most of the modern AI corporate research is basically going to the ready-made products. There is a black box. You don't know what's going on behind. And it obviously increases the shares of those companies, which is fine. They have to make money. But it creates also unrealistic understanding of AI and something between being totally mesmerized by these machines or being afraid in some sort of Frankenstein or a Luddite style that we have to be. And that's not healthy. Therefore, our aim is a bit deeper, to have a deeper understanding how it functions and to ultimately create this augmented intelligence where we will be in charge, inshallah.
Thank you. And I think that's the key point. We can't shy away from these technologies. We have to experiment, but then with a critical eye. As you said, well, our time for today is up. So all that's left for me to do is basically thank our speakers for their time today, but also for all the research and all the hard work that went into preparing the session and doing the research that we were able to share today. So thank you so much to Diplo team, also to our special guest, Stephanie Fillon, for sharing their insights and for giving us a very, very broad overview of what happened at this year's high-level segment of the UN General Assembly, in terms of topics, but also in terms of style, in terms of visual style, and then also giving us a glimpse on the technological possibilities, both in terms of analysis of what's happening at the UNGA, as well as in terms of moving towards the question of, can we actually replace the human work that goes into writing these speeches, and to what extent? So thank you so much. Also, thank you for those who joined us today and listened and started to think about all these very important questions. There are a couple of things we will follow up with, our own research, of course, the speech generator, and then from there we can continue the discussion on these broad questions. So thank you so much to everyone and hope to see you soon in a similar setting.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.